The Pulpit Freedom Sunday strategy might seem odd or provocative to some, but once you understand a bit about the legal landscape on this issue, you'll see how important this strategy really is. First, the way that Congress has drafted the laws prohibit ADF from going out tomorrow and filing a lawsuit to have the Johnson Amendment declared unconstitutional. The Johnson Amendment is a 1954 addition to the tax code that restricts a pastor's right to speak freely from the pulpit on the issue of candidates in elections. Instead, the law mandates that we must wait for the Johnson Amendment to be applied in a certain circumstance before we can challenge its application as unconstitutional. That means a church must be investigated and punished by the IRS for something that was said from the pulpit before we can take action to overturn the amendment. Second, the IRS has become very good at shielding the Johnson Amendment from any constitutional scrutiny. No court anywhere in the country has ever had the opportunity to decide whether the IRS has the right to censor a pastor's sermon. Let me give you an example of how the IRS does this. In 2004, a large church in Pasadena, California was investigated by the IRS for something their pastor said from the pulpit that could be interpreted as an endorsement of one of the candidates running for president. The IRS audited the church, but the church stood strong for its constitutional rights. At the end of the audit, when it seemed as if the IRS was going to punish the church, instead, the IRS sent the church a letter that essentially said, "You violated the Johnson Amendment, don't do it again, we're closing our file." The pastor of the church was quoted in the newspaper as saying that the church had no more understanding now of what the Johnson Amendment prohibits than it did when the investigation first started. And this is not the only church the IRS has done this to. The vagueness of the Johnson Amendment itself is a huge problem. The IRS, in trying to enforce the Johnson Amendment, issues vague regulations that say things like churches cannot directly or indirectly participate in a campaign, but the IRS never defines what indirect participation is. The IRS has done its best to muddy the waters and freely admits that there is no bright line between what speech is permissible and what speech is prohibited. Through its vague guidance and refusal to allow this issue to go to court, the IRS has fostered and pursued an enforcement scheme of intimidation, censorship, and fear. Advocacy groups like Americans United for Separation of Church and State take advantage of this atmosphere to further intimidate pastors and churches. They threaten churches and pastors, draft letters to the IRS about churches they think have crossed the line, and send out press releases claiming that pastors or churches have endangered their tax-exempt status. Even though groups like this are usually always wrong about the law, the damage is done because public perception is furthered that pastors should just stay out of politics. Pastors, unsure of where the line is, self-censor, effectively chilling speech from the pulpit. Then the IRS backs away from any court challenge, allowing this atmosphere of intimidation to persist and grow. That's why this strategy of Pulpit Freedom Sunday is so important and necessary. Essentially, we want the IRS to make a decision that it will either not enforce this law against a pastor's sermon from the pulpit, or that it will allow us to take this issue to court to challenge the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment. We need you to stand with us, together with hundreds of other pastors, to reclaim your right to speak freely from the pulpit. Sign up today at pulpitfreedom.org.